Jung Chang wrote a book that blew away decades of lies told by a tyranny. She wrote Wild Swans. For the last decade, she's been working on a biography of Mao Zedong, whose monstrous aim was to produce total subservience through terror. But it didn't work with her.
Jung Chang, we've got a long way to go back, but let's start with now. What's happening in China? Is it changing?
Yes, it's changing, and actually it has been changing in the last 2 decades and more. And it's a very different country now from what I described in Wild Swans. That was Mao's time, and this is a post-Mao.
Well, what is the main factor of change? Is it the ruling caste giving up on the idea of strict socialism and embracing the capitalist road?
Yes, there is a big private sector in the society now. And I think making money is actually more the in thing than anywhere else. I think perhaps the biggest change is that people's lives are much better. A lot of people now have quite decent lives.
It's a lot of people, though. It's 1,000 million people, more?
1.2 billion.
1.2 billion.
Yes, people, but of course, I mean, it's uneven in the villages in the back end of China. The change is less, and people's lives are much harder. But in the city, there is a big middle class now, which lives a reasonably good life. But of course, then we have to say a lot of things have not changed, and I think have not changed as much.
The Communist Party still rules.
The Communist Party still rules, and there is still strict censorship in the media and in publication. For example, my book Wild Swans is still banned.
You can't read Wild Swans in China. Do you get into trouble if you own a copy?
No, you don't exactly get into trouble, but you probably won't read in public. There is an edition published in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and many copies have gone into China. But if you post it into China, it could well get intercepted. But anyway, it's not allowed to be published. And also, for example, I go to China often. In fact, I go there probably once or twice a year to research for my book, my next book.
You're writing a book on Mao Zedong.
Yes.
I want to get to that later.
Right. But once I'm there, the media, for example, is not allowed to interview me.
What's the main reason for that? Is it because it tells the truth about the past, and the ruling caste now wants the country to change, but they still don't want to face the past?
That's exactly what it is. Yes, there is still an official line about China's recent past. Not recent, I mean, 20th century China. And my book obviously doesn't toe that official line. And so the government doesn't want people to know. It doesn't want people to know the truth about China's modern Chinese history. And basically, there is still brainwashing going on in the schools.
Well, it's a terrible truth, and your book told it. Your book bowled me over. I thought I knew something.
Thank you.
I knew something about what had gone on in China. I knew about the Great Leap Forward and so on. But your book puts the reader right in it because you were in it. I mean, you began... You were a Red Guard.
Well, very briefly, thank God.
You were very young.
Yes, I was 14, but only for a couple of months because, that was 1966. There was a lot of violence, a lot of atrocities, and they just went against my nature, and so I left after a couple of months.
I remember that very year I was in Cambridge, and a lot of the young students there were having meetings saying about how wonderful China was, and the Cultural Revolution was the beginning of a new era for mankind. Yes. And I rather suspected at the time that this was not so, but we didn't know the facts. The facts weren't coming out. And it took a long time for the facts to come out. And I did.
Yes, well, the thing is, in fact, at the time, there were some accounts about communist China. Some accounts written by refugees. But I think people tended to, and still tend to, discount refugees. They think, they are biased for some reason. And I think people begin to believe them now.
I know you're writing a book on Mao, and there's a big paradox that strikes me about him, is that when he started, he wanted to change things, but he wasn't in favor of violence when he began. Well, he still thought things could be changed by argument, by democratic means. I mean, he's a monster, but did he begin as a monster, I'm asking?
I think he didn't begin. He began as an extremely selfish man. But he became a monster once he met Stalinism in the 1920s. That was quite early, actually. And then he saw Stalinist methods, Stalinist violence, and he loved it. And then from there on, he was awful.
Yes, and he sort of really instituted a permanent purge. I think it's sometimes a mistake, from what I've learned of Chinese history, to look at each extreme phase and think of them as separate with a period of peace in between. Is that the party was always ruling by terror, one intensity or another, was it not?
Yes, absolutely. I think terror it was the entire foundation of Mao's rule. And he pursued, and whenever he wanted something done, he would have a round of terrorization in the society.
But the extraordinary thing was, it didn't really get done, did it? Was the Great Leap Forward a great leap forward in any way, except the immense total of people killed, for example?
No, he had his goals, of course. I mean, we have discovered a very different Mao from even what I had imagined before I started working on the biography, which is obviously going to emerge in our book. And he was single-minded.
You're not writing it alone. Yeah.
No, that's right. I'm not. I'm writing it with my husband, who's a historian called John Halliday.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make that clear. Okay, so very different Mao. Huh?
He had one particular goal in mind, or a series of goals, and he was pursuing them single-mindedly. And along the way, he created these big disasters in China.
Well, what went wrong with? What was the idea of the Great Leap Forward? Was it to haul China suddenly into the modern age? Yeah?
If I answer this question, that would inevitably involve a main thesis in our book, which because it's not going to be published yet. Yes, it's going to be published next year, spring next year.
I can't wait.
I just sort of, the answer actually is quite simple, but I really can't get into that because...
How fascinating.
Because people would have access to it before my book comes out.
Well, we'll leave the Great Leap Forward aside. And the mystery to me is not so much that he oppressed the people, because you can make people do things if you scare them enough, but he never stopped purging his own party. It wasn't enough to be loyal to Mao.
Well, the problem is, because Mao's goals were so awful, so diabolical, he never had the majority in the party. He never had popular support from the Chinese population. He never had popular support in his own party. And he was often the minority in his core leadership. And therefore, he had to constantly purge these people in order to pursue his objectives.
Can you remember what it was like at school to be taught about Mao? Were you taught to worship him and think of him as infallible?
When I was growing up, yes, there was this intense personality cult. I mean, there was a song every child in China had to learn to sing, and it went, "Father is close, mother is close, but neither is as close as Chairman Mao."
Can you sing it for me?
I can't remember now. Well, no, I don't. I mean, it actually brings back horrible memories.
Oh, well, I wouldn't want to do that.
I don't want to.
Now, the message there is that your first loyalty is to Mao and not to your parents.
That's right.
That opens up all kinds of possibilities, doesn't it?
Exactly. You know, in the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1966, or even before the Cultural Revolution, children were encouraged to denounce their parents if their parents were deemed to be undesirable by Mao's system. But the thing is, you see, Mao never quite succeeded because a lot of human goodness was also very deep rooted in a person's nature. I can say that, for example, with my family, when I had to choose between Mao's teaching, or Mao, loyalty, whatever, to Mao, and my parents, I chose my parents.
Your mother's story emerges from the book as it's very, very hard for the reader to take. It was a hell of a life. Right?
Yes, my mother had a terrible life. My mother, again, you see, wives, well, we encouraged to denounce their husbands and vice versa. But my mother stood by my father, even though she actually had a lot of bitterness against
He was
my
a member
father.
of the Communist Party who got on the wrong side of the regime, was he not?
He was a communist official, and he spoke up at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution against the atrocities. And as a result, he was arrested, tortured, driven insane. My mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce him, but she refused. And as a result, she suffered tremendously. I mean, she went through over 100 those gruesome denunciation meetings. She was, tortured and tormented, abused. I mean, she was paraded in the streets when children spat at her and threw stones at her. But in spite of all that, she stood by my father and would not denounce him.
I don't want to distress you, but did that make your position difficult? Because if he was an enemy of the people and she becomes an enemy of the people for not denouncing him, then the pressure is on you to denounce her.
The pressure was definitely on the children to denounce our parents, but we stood by them. In fact, we were, I think my family grew closer in the Cultural Revolution because of all this. And in those days, I think I had a love for my parents with the intensity which would not I would not have had in normal times. But because they were victims, and so my love for them took on this defiance. So I was actually, I went with my parents, for example, to their denunciation meetings and sat in the audience, so they would know that there was somebody there who loved them, who they felt sort of comforted.
I think any reader who was brought up in a democracy will, when reading your book, just can't help thinking, well, that could have been me if I'd been there. Luckily, I wasn't. When I was brought up in Australia, the state couldn't interfere with your education. All the state did was pay for it. Whereas the state interfered constantly with your education and determined what happened to you next and the whole shape of your career. If you stayed in China, for example, you would never have become a linguisticist and all the things that you become. What happened to you at school age when you were leaving school?
Well, the thing is, when I was 14, in the Cultural Revolution started, and all schooling stopped. Mao wanted to keep the whole population idle, particularly the violent, destructive, easily manipulated, manipulatable teenagers idle, in order to devote themselves exclusively to the violence and destruction. So there was no schooling for 7 years.
It seems so demented because it couldn't possibly have any other effect long term except to destroy the country's economic performance.
I mean, he's got his objectives. Again, we are, my husband and I are going to describe the process or what exactly was Mao up to in our new book, biography of Mao. Because he had his own, he's got his
own agenda?
His own agenda, definitely, yes. And it followed his way of thinking.
Well, we'll keep that.
Among those, revenge was a very big factor. He wanted to, anyway, we're going to talk about that.
It sounds like revenge against China. Okay, you're sitting on that one too. I fully respect your position. It's just that I'm fascinated because I'm just fascinated by the counterproductive behavior of tyrants. I mean, Stalin did the same thing before World War II. He purged the army at the very moment when he needed the army to defend him against Hitler. Why did he do it? And it's very, very hard to find an answer. The behavior is so irrational. It's this combination of absolute power and irrationality that fascinates me. And
yes. I mean, Mao, yes. Of course, I mean, he had his agenda. All I can say is he had his agenda. He wanted to, unless he did a thorough purge, this at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, he couldn't have his way. I mean, he wanted to have his way. I mean, his agenda is a very important thing. What was Mao's agenda? What made him tick? What was he up to before he came to power? Obviously, he wanted to conquer China. And after he came to power, what was he up to?
Well, in the Cultural Revolution, he obviously wanted to stop education.
Well, that was means for a goal.
Right.
He stopped education in order to have these to release these teenagers from the classrooms, so they could let rip their, violence and destructiveness. I mean, in fact, indeed, as Mao said, they are fed. I mean, they have no schools to go to. What do? They make trouble. They create chaos. What else do you expect of them?
And this happened to you. Your schooling was stopped. So what happened? So what did you do?
For a couple of years, because my parents were victims of the Cultural Revolution, so I devoted my life to them, basically. And then I was exiled.
How could you afford it? How did you stay alive?
My parents' salaries were cut, but we were given a sort of minimum allowance, basically, so we managed to live. And my grandmother was alive then. My grandmother died in the Cultural Revolution also as a result of all these things happened to my mother and happened to her, happened to the family.
Broken heart. Right.
Broken heart and illness, and also she fell ill. But in hospitals, people were not working normally. I mean, the X-ray machines weren't working. The doctors and nurses were often condemned if they stuck to their work, to their professional work, rather than devoting themselves to the violence and denunciations, which was what Mao wanted them to do. So my grandmother didn't have proper treatment, and then she died. Anyway, before that,
for 2 years you tried to look after your parents.
Yes, and then I was exiled to the villages, to the edge of the Himalayas, and then later I became. So I worked as a peasant for 3 years. During that time, I worked as a barefoot. Yes, peasant labor, very hard work. I worked also as a barefoot doctor. Barefoot doctor was a doctor without any training. Because Mao's guideline for health and education was the more books you read, the more stupid you become.
This theory became very popular in the West, actually, among the young student radicals. They liked the idea of an unqualified doctor, until, of course, it was their turn for treatment.
Exactly. That's why Mao said the barefoot doctors were there for the peasants. Of course, they were not there for him, and he always had first-class treatment for himself.
Actually, I read the book by Mao's doctor, which was a revelation in itself. He made sure he was pampered, actually, right to the end.
Yes.
Anyway, you were a barefoot doctor.
I was a barefoot doctor. And then then things began to become better because Mao, after a period of years of just upheaval, he wanted to bring the country back into control and to continue to pursue his agenda, which actually, basically, ultimately was to conquer the world. So
is that one of the secret theses of your?
Yeah, that is the. But I mean, it's not just hollow words. Anyway.
So didn't he, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, he managed to get the blame off himself, didn't he?
Well, he didn't. Actually, he didn't care. This is another very... anyway, I'll follow up on my experience,
yeah, sure.
which is then in 1971, I was able to leave the countryside, leave the village, and went to a factory and became a steel worker and then an electrician. And I had absolutely no training. So in the first month, I had 5 electric shocks.
What sort of steel did you produce?
Well, we were putting this, I mean, it was just absolutely horrible. And people were putting, it was basically a foundry with these huge containers of boiling
Liquid
steel,
metal,
liquid
yeah.
metal, yes, sort of racing over our head. So you can understand, I mean, accidents were frequent. I was very lucky. I didn't have any, but I had my electric shocks.
So,
And then in 1973, schools and universities began to reopen after many years. And I was able to get into Sichuan University to learn English.
But you hadn't really studied anything since you were 14, or had you
That's
been?
right. I had. Well, I sort of did some study myself. In fact, during that period, I read over 1,000 Chinese and European classics, and the reason was my brother, my 13-year-old brother, was an entrepreneur, was a sort of entrepreneur, and he discovered a black market. Selling these books. In the Cultural Revolution, books were also burned and destroyed and pulped. But there were people who saved their books, and then these books were then on sale.
There was a market, a black market.
Yes, a black market. And my brother then bought these over 1,000
And
classics.
you read them all.
I read them all. And my brother made his money dealing in a Mao badge. In those days, there were just these millions and millions
I think I had one
of
at
the
one
Mao
stage.
badge. Yes, there were huge ones, and once even some young man pinned on their bare flesh, to demonstrate their loyalty to Mao. Anyway, my brother, and because all collecting was banned and was condemned as a bourgeois habit, so my brother couldn't collect stamps, which he loved, and I couldn't collect whatever things he loved to collect. And so he collected the Mao badges and made a small fortune dealing in them. And then he was able to use the money to buy books.
And so when you went to university, you were actually well prepared.
No, I was, English I taught myself a little bit during those years, but very, very little. And anyway, in the university years, our first lesson was Long Live Chairman Mao. This was our text. And the second lesson was greetings. And because the Chinese in those days greeted each other with 吃饭了吗?上哪儿去? Which means, where are you going? Have you eaten? And those were the greetings we learned. So when I first came to Britain, I used to go around and ask people where they were going and whether they had eaten. And it was, although English, was my subject, but we would be condemned if we were seen to be working too hard at it, which was another lunacy in Mao's rule. And if I was reading a text, I was reading an English book, which I got thanks to the help of the librarians of the university library. If somebody came along, I had to quickly cover it with a newspaper. And the most ridiculous thing was there were absolutely no foreigners for us to speak English to. And of course, it was punishable by imprisonment if you tried to listen to the BBC or the Voice of America or foreign radio. And the only foreigners I talked to before I came to Britain in 1978 was some foreign sailors in a port in South China, where we were sent to practice our English. This was 1975, and I was 23. And we would be sitting in the restaurant and the bar, eagerly awaiting for our foreigners because they were our only chance.
You know, it was still happening in 1982. I was in China as part of the press corps with Margaret Thatcher in Beijing, and when I came out of my hotel, students would come running towards me just to have a conversation and trail me to the park. And one of them was carrying a copy of the Concise English Dictionary, and he told me it was his turn for the dictionary that week. They had a club, and they would pass the dictionary one to another. And the books were so precious.
Yes, yes. And of course, in those days, 1982, I mean, Mao had already died. You know, things were already changing, or changed a lot. And people dared to come to you to speak. Whereas with us, we were only authorized to talk to these people, the sailors.
There's one question I have to ask, because it was so restrictive, and you were seen to fraternize with the West in any way. It was really a crime. How did you manage to leave the country?
Oh, I left in 1978, and Mao died. Mao had died in 1976, and things immediately began to change. And for the first time in communist China, scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis and through exams. So I sat for an exam, and I did reasonably well.
Jung Chang, I'm going to call a halt there because we have another program to do.
Oh, okay.
We know, and it's going to be with you. And not now, but you've got to come back and tell me more.
Okay. Right, yes.
The story is just so fascinating. And we're getting closer to Mao all the time. Strange enough, now that he's dead, you can start getting him in perspective.
Yes.
And thank you so much for your life, for your book, and for your next book.
Yes,
Jung
thank
Chang.
you. Thank you.